the biggest hurdle was more learning what I could eat. And I went from 150 pounds to 105 pounds in about a month.
What is up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Assemble Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Jones. Whether I'm hitting the trails, training for an ultramarathon, or pushing my limits in the gym strength training, I've always been fascinated by what drives us to perform at our best. This podcast is for everyone, from the serious endurance, strength, or hybrid athlete to the outdoor enthusiast who wants to live life to the fullest. I believe that peak performance is an assembly of physical training, mental fortitude, emotional health, and social support. Whether you're training for a sport or viewing life itself as the ultimate athletic event, join me in redefining limits and living a life full of challenges and adventure. Let's get into today's podcast. What's up, guys? We have Michelle Lemaster on the podcast today. She is currently finishing her Ph.D. in food and meat science. She's from the US, but is actually doing her Ph.D. in Australia. So we're at a good 16-hour time difference right now. She has a background in running, hiking, equestrian shows, and has climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. So very varied background there. And she has a goal to run a race in every US state. So Michelle, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. It's good. You've got a awesome background. I love talking to people with such varied experiences. So I thought maybe we'd
Well,
start
thank you.
with,
I appreciate that.
yeah, I thought maybe we'd start with your background and what got you into all that. Like at what point in your life, how long you've been doing so many athletic things.
I think growing up, so I grew up in Ohio, and I think with all of the changes in seasons, there's always something that I could do. So I actually started in high school I started before that, but competitively, volleyball, swim team. And then ironically enough, hated running growing up. And then one Thanksgiving, my older sister said, you know what? Cincinnati always has this really fun Thanksgiving race. Why don't we do it together? It'll be fun. A good way to start the day. And then we kind of looked at that as an excuse to basically eat a lot the rest of the day. And I didn't practice, like, I didn't train for that race at all before I did it. So it was a 10K race. Showed up on Thanksgiving, and I was like, "Oh, I don't know what I've been thinking. This is actually really fun." Part of it is because I ended up beating my sister, which is always, sibling rivalry is always pretty strong, I think, in our house when it comes to sports. And I don't know, I just fell in love because this was towards the end of my first year in college. And you know, with semester finals and things like that. It's just like I hated all of the stress around that, and running was just such a good outlet. And basically after that Thanksgiving race, I just picked up running. 2 months later, I ended up doing a half marathon, and I actually ended up winning that half marathon, and I thought, "Oh, I'm pretty good at this." So, yeah, I just kept doing that, and like I said, it's a really good way to manage stress and anxiety and things like that, and especially if you start your day like that, it's just I don't know. I can't think of a really better way to start the day, so that's it.
Yeah, I agree. I ran cross country in high school, so I feel the same way. Funny enough, I think we talked before that we're both from Ohio, so small world.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. The running it through the varied seasons too in Ohio. I don't know. I think it's just fun.
It is fun. Even in the middle of a blizzard, you can still do it.
Yep.
It's probably not highly recommended, but you can still do it.
You get a little ego boost out there in the snow.
That's right, that's right.
So you also did equestrian shows though. When did you start getting into that?
So I did what's called 4-H. So it's mainly basically an organization for agricultural kids. And my projects were always with horses just because, I think every little girl loves horses. But then I fell in love with that. So I started showing, I think I was 8 years old. And I ended up actually competing on the equestrian team for the Ohio State University. So basically did that all through Ohio State. And then I have a couple horses of my own. They're actually in Florida with my parents right now. But yeah, that's basically been, I would say, probably my bigger passion as far as athletics go. But yeah, again, it just comes back to, doing something with the body moving and everything. It's such a good way to get rid of all of the stress. So,
That's so cool. Yeah, I had a lot of friends that did 4-H. I did FFA for 1 year, so
okay, so you know
it's
what
so
I'm
cool.
talking about.
100%. Yeah, yeah. I grew up in super middle of nowhere, so
Yeah.
uh, it's always fun to talk to someone who gets it.
Yes, I agree. I
So
came
you
to
said
Australia and everyone was like, "What is that?" They don't have programs like that here, so
it's a different world over there.
yeah.
So you did your bachelor's and your master's at Ohio State, right?
Yes.
So what led you to flying over to Australia for your PhD?
So, it's actually it's a bit of an interesting story, I guess, how I got into food and meat science. I actually started at Ohio State in the veterinary studies. So, kind of took a 180-degree turn with the meat science side of it, but I started in veterinary studies kind of because of my background with horses and everything. But I was also at the time when I went to Ohio State, I was going through a lot of really pretty intense medical issues. I had recently been diagnosed with celiac disease. Basically, after I was diagnosed with celiac disease, I found out I was um, allergic to a lot of other foods. So I basically cut out most food from my diet and was really sick, like super thin, really underweight, and just really weak. And a lot of this actually had pretty strong impacts on my muscles and nerves. And I had no idea what was going on. In one of my classes at Ohio State, I would say he's actually probably the most profound person on my academic career thus far. He came in to give a lecture on um, more the meat science side of animal studies. And I had no idea that this was a thing. But every single thing he was talking about was with muscles and nerves. And I was like, oh my goodness, I can kind of explain what's happening in my own body with this stuff. And then because of my background with food restrictions and things, knowing that there was an academic pathway for food science and meat science and basically that whole avenue, I was hooked from the start. And then did my master's at Ohio State. And then I had an opportunity to present my master's research at a conference in Ireland. And when I was in Ireland, I met the supervisors that I'm working with now, and they offered me a scholarship to come do my PhD. And I figured it'd be a pretty silly thing to turn that down. So I moved over here at the end of 2019. So right before all of the lockdowns and all of the fun pandemic stuff. But yeah, I've been here ever since and hopefully submitting my thesis soon. But yeah, after that, I think the world's kind of open for me to figure out what pathway to take next.
That's awesome. So celiac disease. For those who don't know what celiac is, what is it and how does it like manifest in your day to day life?
So it's basically an autoimmune disorder and things with gluten. So wheat, rye, barley, just to name the most basics. If I were to ingest that, I guess the surface level, the way my body looks at those types of food is basically foreign invaders. And my body starts attacking those foods. But the problem is when that clings to your gut, it also starts kind of attacking your gut. And then, yeah, basically wreaks havoc on the body until you figure out how to manage that. I I think part of it is because my background with food science, I don't actually really think of celiac disease too much anymore, mainly because I make all of my food. I love cooking, which probably helps a bit, but I just know how to avoid those things. But this is kind of what I was talking about before I started with meat science. The way that celiac disease, if I get exposed to gluten, interacts with my body is actually causing a lot of muscle spasms throughout the body, nerve pain. So I'm hypersensitive to just like even the touch of a shirt, and then what's called brain fog. So it's really hard for me to concentrate and focus on anything. And those symptoms usually last about a week or two before it gets back to normal. So I do my absolute best to avoid all of that. Sometimes it's a little bit trickier, like if you go out to restaurants, but there's also pretty basic steps to take when you do that as well.
So gluten, clearly, pretty much everybody probably knows you can get a lot of gluten free options. What is like gluten specifically? We don't have to get too in depth if you don't want to, but some people don't even know. They're just like, oh, gluten. Some people can't have it.
Yeah. Some people get really sick from it. Some people just don't want it. So it's basically just a protein that's found in things like wheat, rye, and barley. If if you've ever tried gluten-free breads and pastries and things, you know that there's a pretty distinct textural difference between, normal pastries and breads, and part of that is because the way gluten works is that's essentially the component of pastries that maintains the texture of all of those foods. So when you take that out, you have to find something that can replace that in, I guess, as best way possible, but I think that's probably the biggest challenge with some of the larger food companies. It's like, how do we replace this natural protein with something that can kind of do the same thing? But essentially, it is just a protein that helps form the textural differences in baked good.
So you mentioned in your when you scheduled that you climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and you said against doctor's orders. So
Yeah.
is that due to celiac and the allergies?
So, no, but I think, yeah, when I had celiac disease diagnosed, like I said, I kind of cut out a lot of food just because I didn't have anyone there to show me what you can eat and what's safe to eat, things like that. Like, I kind of had to figure that out on my own. But when I did that, I went about it in probably the worst way possible, where I was told by, a nutritionist to basically cut out all foods and live on chicken broth and green beans for about a month. Not very sustainable at all, and I went from 150 pounds to 105 pounds in about a month. So, super thin, obviously a really unhealthy weight for an adult woman, but one of the things that happened when I got so thin is that basically, because I have a couple of heart issues growing up, but also because I was running on fumes because I wasn't fueling my body, my cardiologist told me that I was at a really high risk for a heart attack. And he said, if you climb Mount Kilimanjaro, you know, that's probably not a good idea because it could make things worse. Obviously, it's higher altitude and not a lot of hospitals around there if there's an emergency. So that was actually why I was against doctor's orders because of the cardiac risk. And again, that's going back to because I was so thin and not fueling my body the right way.
But you did it anyways.
I did.
What was going through your head for that decision?
I figured, I'm in Africa, why not? And like, this was when I was younger, so I was probably a bit more carefree than I am now. Like, I have all of these, you know, bigger things that I'm, responsible for, taking care of now, and back then it was like, "Oh, whatever." So I figured if something happens, at least it'd be a cool story. When I told my parents that, they weren't very happy with me, but but I did it. I When we summited the mountain, so it was a couple days process to get there. But when we actually summited, we left our base camp at midnight so that we could get to the top right as the sun was rising over Africa, which was pretty cool. I got a great picture, and then as soon as I got that picture, I was like, I need to get to a lower altitude like now. So yeah.
That's cool though.
Probably not my best decision, but it made for a good story.
Yeah, do not condone, but you'll never get that. You'll never lose that experience.
That's right.
That's awesome. So you mentioned a few times under eating. Clearly, you really had no idea how to eat. I work
Yeah.
with a lot of endurance athletes, and as you might know, like endurance athletes can underfuel a lot. So I see it a lot. And then even as a population, like women in general, just tend to have a hard time eating a lot. So I bring it up a lot of something I'm really passionate about because everybody's really aware of the issues with overeating, but not a lot of
Yeah.
people are aware of the issues with undereating. So could you maybe speak to that? I mean, you even mentioned like you were at a high risk for a heart attack, which most people wouldn't even think about.
Yeah, well, it's kind of either end of the spectrum you go, whether it's excessively overeating or, like in my case, barely eating at all. You're straining your body, like every single aspect of your body to its basically its edge. And, you know, like for me, I was at that really low weight. So it's basically you are expecting your body to run and run properly on almost no fuel. And it's the way I look at it is, and again, I can speak to that really under eating population just because that's what happened to me. But the way I look at it is if you think of a car, like think of a really nice car. I'm not like a car expert, so I'm just gonna think of the first car that comes to mind, like a Jaguar. They're pretty fancy, right? You're not gonna put the cheapest fuel in that car and expect it to run properly, but you're also not going to let it run on fumes because you know that it's, again, not going to run properly. Obviously, our bodies are more important than cars, but it's the same concept. Like, if you're not giving your body fuel, you can't expect it to run properly, and then especially, like, if you're not even getting that baseline nutrition, everything's going to essentially go haywire, and yeah, you're, as I said, straining every part of your body to the point where you could be at a high risk for a heart attack or a stroke or things like that, and when you're told that as an 18-year-old, that's terrifying because you're like, "What are you talking about?" I had never heard of someone who was so thin having a heart attack. But my doctor said, especially as you mentioned, in women who are under eating or for whatever reason, if it's because they're not fueling their bodies, if they're endurance athletes, like that is such a real risk that no one talks about. And yeah, especially as a young girl, it's like, what? I had no idea. But as soon as I was told that, I started to really actually notice how sick I was and how unhealthy I was. But it kind of took, you know, actually being told, "Hey, this could kill you. This isn't like a joking matter anymore," but not that it ever was. But yeah, that it is pretty scary, but it's essentially just stretching your body to the absolute limit. And if you do that day in and day out, there is going to be a breaking point.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm actually studying for the NSCA's strength and conditioning specialist. And even in that textbook, they bring it up multiple times about women specifically from a coaching perspective being mindful of your athletes. Like, hey, these are signs to watch for of under eating. Like, I knew it was an issue. And obviously, with people I work with, it comes up a lot. But it was interesting to see in like an official textbook, like 3 or 4 times it's brought it up. So
Yeah, it's a big deal.
yeah, it is. It is. And a lot of the stuff you consider to be normal, at least me growing up as an athlete, a lot of the symptoms of undereating, like we just thought was normal because we were endurance athletes and we were high
Yeah.
schoolers. So we were already burning a lot of calories.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it is a bit, I don't know, I almost feel like overeating is so talked about, and that's, like, I feel like the focus of the health industry, and again, like, I've never really been in that situation, so it's harder for me to, I guess, speak on that ground, but for the undereating, it's actually more frequent than people, I think, realize, and like you said, I almost feel like it's impossible for endurance athletes to not undereat, just because you're burning so much fuel, and then you know, like, I've done half marathons and marathons. I don't know how far your endurance athletes usually run, but some of them are probably like, "Oh, half marathon, that's nothing." I do that this every day. But I feel like that is such a task for your body to do alone, and then, depending the length of the runs and all of the workouts and things, you basically don't have energy to do anything else for the rest of the day, much less, go and cook a meal or even sometimes I know, like, when I was training for my marathon, I was like, "I'm just too tired to even eat right now. Like, I just wanna sleep. I just wanna rest," things like that, and yeah, after you ask your body to run these crazy amounts of miles, and then you're basically going, "Okay, well, you did that, but" you're not getting fuel to replenish that for the next one or the next one after that, and that's why I think it's really hard for endurance athletes to not undereat.
Yeah, I think obviously overeating is a big issue in the US, just statistically. But like you said, it doesn't really get the light kind of gets all put on them and not on the undereating. And then I think social media too, especially all these, kind of very high driven athletes, right? All they see online is people doing more than them. So they can even downplay, like, oh, yeah, I ran a half marathon. Like, that isn't even that much. Like, Like,
Yep.
why do I need to eat this many calories? It isn't that much. I just watched this YouTube video. This guy ran 100 miles, you know. But then, I've had some athletes come to me that are even marathon runners, and they're like, "Hey, I feel horrible. I have no energy." And I look at how much they're eating, and they're eating like 1,400 calories a day, 1,500 calories a day, and it's like,
Well,
it's so difficult because it's so emotional too.
yeah. Well, and especially with endurance races, I when I did so I've only run 1 marathon, and I struggled with that because I definitely overtrained, even though everyone was like, "Don't do this." So I'm like, "Whatever, it's fine. It'll probably help me." It didn't, but I know the last 6 miles of that marathon, it wasn't necessarily, I was struggling with my body, it was the mental factor, and it's like, you hit that wall and you're like, "Why am I doing this? What am I gaining out of this?" But it is such a mental, toll on our body as much as it is physical, and that's when having proper nutrition and fuel really come in handy, and while it might seem like you're overeating and I know, like, I went through a period where I was specifically over counting the calories that I was consuming to avoid overeating. This was before I was told, like, "You're really sick, you need to work on this." But I was like, yeah, I was over counting calories because I'm like, well, I don't want to get into the point where I'm overeating and gaining so much weight. So, and I think that is also something that a lot of women do, that it's like, we're just gonna steer on the side of caution and, you know, count extra for whatever it is we're eating. But yeah, the food and the fuel that you get can I was listening to a lecture the other day. This nutritionist was basically saying the fuel that you eat can help you feel really good, power you through every activity that you want to do, or it can make you feel stressed, anxious, and really dumb. Like, but at the end of the day, it's your choice what kind of fuel you're giving your body.
I love that. I uh
Yeah.
I work with a lot of athletes, but I have a lot of like general population people come too that want to lose some weight. And it's very difficult because they've got these varied histories with different programs, all the named programs out there that sell stuff. And I really love the same kind of mindset. I tell them like, I'll worry about the weight loss. Like, you just focus on, hey, I'm going to eat this to fuel my body to make myself stronger,
Yep.
healthier. And we kind of go through an informational, like, this is what's happening. You're going to be healthier, live a longer, healthier life, be able to basically live a fuller life and not feel so restricted. Like, a lot of
Yeah.
diets make you feel.
Yes. Well, and that even comes like when you go through a restrictive diet, it's actually the way our brain kind of looks at that is basically like, "Oh, I'm not allowed to eat this." So as soon as you say no to something, your brain tends to fixate on that, and then all you wanna do is eat that, and then as soon as you get your hands on, like, whatever it is, if it's, chips or chocolate or whatever, and I'm not saying that those things are like, you can't have those. I eat chocolate every now and again because who doesn't? But if you tell yourself, like, "No, I can't have X, Y, or Z," you start fixating on that, and then you tend to binge eat once you actually start to eat those things because you feel deprived, even if it's been, like, a day, you know? But,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
it's pretty fascinating, I think, how the brain-body connection works with food.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually how much your education kind of goes into that because I've sat through a ton of like courses and done a ton of coaching courses, and the food like dietitian side of things to me as a coach, I'm always asking myself like where's the line between like nutrition behavior change and like actual therapy, because it
Yeah.
seems so thin because some of the stuff goes way back like to childhood and how food was modeled, and like it's super
Yeah.
complex.
Yeah, so I look, I probably can't speak to that because I'm not a nutritionist, but so the way like I help people is kind of look at everything from a scientific aspect. So while it can be difficult, I try to take some of the emotions out so that it's more of an objective view and it's just like a critical view of what's actually happening, how the food you're eating is impacting the body, whether it's gut health, whether it's, I think a lot of people overlook probably what's the most important organ in the body, which is the brain and how food really impacts the brain. So that's kind of what I like to do that way, I'm not, like, getting into some of that, murky territory where it's like, I don't wanna be the role of the therapist because I'm not qualified for that. But I can talk about the scientific aspect of it all day long. And I think when it comes to things like restrictive dieting, having an emotional, I don't know, I guess, connection to different foods, whether it's like going back to chocolate or chips or things like that, there's such a strong scientific point there that you can just go really deep with that instead of talking about like, oh, how does this food, like what's the background? How were you raised with this stuff? Like obviously that's important. But I think a lot of times people just need the knowledge of how certain foods influence the body and brain. And once they have that knowledge, they're set for life. But I think one of the I guess growing up and getting all of these, certificates and everything and almost a PhD now, I think it's really been pretty obvious to me that there's almost no educational background of nutrition, how to properly eat growing up. And that's the most important time to really focus on nutrition because it basically sets the foundation for the rest of your life. But again, as soon as someone has that knowledge and information, it's up to them to basically use it or, ignore everything, but I think people just don't have that information sometimes, so I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I've had a few people come to work with me and they've had like some rocky background with some eating disorders from other things. And I'm pretty quick to like, notice that this is not in my skill practice and refer out where needed. But for some people, it's really they just don't have the information. Like if you just objectively show them like, hey, there's no bad foods, like look at this. This is, no
Yeah,
emotion has to be tied to this food. And then you can start to break those things because like you said, they get this is a food they're not allowed to have. And so your brain says, oh, I want that more.
I want
And
it, yeah.
yeah,
So
it's such a horrible cycle.
yeah. Well, and okay, I think this probably comes back to, like, when I was sick as well, but I went through that where it's like, I was told I can only eat chicken broth for a month. Nobody wants that. There's no sustenance to that. So, this was in the middle of the summer with all the barbecues and cookouts and everything. So I was around people that were, you know, just eating whatever they wanted, whatever came off the grill. And I'm sitting there with a tiny bowl of chicken broth and I'm like, I want that. And I just kept like it got to the point where I was actually mad at not necessarily the people around me, but I was just mad at the situation because I'm like, this isn't like, I'm not enjoying life right now. This is really difficult, but yeah, now it's like I said, even with celiac, I don't really even think about, the worry or the anxiety around food. Like, I don't have to worry about that anymore just because, again, I have that knowledge and information of basically looking at every single meal I have is nourishing my body so that I can continue to do the things I like running or riding horses or, the mental challenge of getting a PhD, like all of these things I'm able to do because of the nutrition I have.
Yeah, I think that's such an important message because there's a lot of people that are probably in the same situation you were that feel like, super restricted. Like, is this even a life worth living? Like, I can't eat anything. And they don't know, like, clearly you're on the other side of that and you figured it out.
Yeah.
But that just feels like, sounds like such a horrible place to be. I can't imagine.
Yeah, and it was, and there are two situations I guess that I found myself in when I was really thin and basically just like, yeah, basically a zombie essentially. The first was with the cardiologist telling me that I was at a high risk for a heart attack. The second is basically what really pushed me to get better and actually was another push to get into the food science field. And it was actually a conversation I had with my dad. And I don't actually think he remembers having this conversation with me, but it was so profound for me that, it kind of steered me for everything else that I've done. But we were driving. I can't even remember where we were driving, but he looked at me and I knew that he was worried about me. Obviously, he's my dad, but he goes, you can either look at your situation as a burden and let it overtake your life, or you can look at it as a blessing and an opportunity and use it to help others. And that just kind of, hit me like a ton of bricks, and I was like, "Oh, okay." And he's right, I had both of those options. I could have just, dealt with it in a really negative way and let it consume me, or, you know, I'm trying to help other people who are facing that same situation just because I know how dark it can be, and I know how great it is once you get over those hurdles.
That's super cool. That's an awesome story. And I got chills just listening to
Oh.
that. That's cool. I love those kind of stories. It's so inspiring because you do always have the option to go left or right, and it's up to you. You know,
Yeah, my dad always taught us growing up, my sisters and I, life's all about choices, and every choice has a consequence. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, but, at the end of the day, it's up to us to make the right choice, and hopefully I've made him proud making some good choices along the way.
yeah. I mean, I would say so. You're in your PhD. So, with you mentioned a little bit ago the brain, and most people don't think about the brain.
Yeah,
The brain takes up a lot of calories, a lot of oxygen, just a lot of resources in general. I'm interested in when you were training for the marathon, right, with celiac disease, you need a lot of carbs, a lot of glucose, right? The body runs on glucose, the brain runs on glucose. So how did
yeah.
that look for you?
Yeah, well, you're right when you say the brain uses a lot of calories. It actually uses 30% of all the calories that we consume in a day. So, kind of going back to the restrictive dieting or under eating, if you're not even getting baseline calories, you're starving, as I said, the most important organ and the most overlooked organ, the brain, which basically dictates every other thing in your body. So, for me, I struggled, and I don't know if this is related to celiac or not, but I actually struggled if I ate something in the morning and then just went for a run, 30 minutes after. Like, I would usually get stomach cramps and sometimes throw up, which is obviously not great. So I had to strategically fuel, especially the night before, and one of the things that I always had before I went for a run was usually chicken, a lot of chicken, and sweet potatoes were, like, always on my plate, and beetroot as well. Just because of the way beetroot interacts with oxygen, it tends to help oxygen supply as well, but sweet potatoes were probably my saving grace, and I actually found a really basic recipe for making sweet potato waffles. So that was kind of something that I munched on the run. And then my mom found these things. It was basically like low glycemic index, really natural grains, kind of as like cookies almost that I would carry with me. And yeah, I had that and like a little water bottle full of Pedialyte, which is like that baby drink for when babies are dehydrated, but that's all I could stomach. So it was just kind of munching along the way, those really basic crackers, basically.
I used to drink Pedialyte all the time when I ran cross country. That stuff is a saving grace. It's
It
great.
is. Grape flavor is the best.
So I imagine you couldn't even eat like the running gels or anything, right? Those probably had gluten in them.
Well, it wasn't necessarily the gluten, it was I'm not used to eating that much sugar. So the sugar just it it destroyed me every time, and I tried them, I gave them a shot, and I was like, "No," regretted it almost instantly. So that's why I'm drawing a blank on what they were called, but they were like little biscuit cookies that I I knew how much I needed, so I just had a little plastic bag full of them and would just eat those every half mile or so just to keep myself going, but yeah, I could not stomach the gels. So these biscuits, because they're natural grains and things like that, I think yeah, I'm drawing a blank on what they were, but it was like rice and stuff like that mixed in with I think there was syrup in there, so a little bit of sugar, but because of the way they were structured, they were complex carbohydrates, so it was I guess, a more sustained release of glucose that also didn't result in, blood sugar spikes and then also blood sugar crashes as well.
So when it comes to carbs, right? Carbs are important not just for runners, but for everybody, especially endurance
Yep.
athletes though. So could you speak to what I like to tell people is you need to hit your protein goal because you need, protein. And I explain to them why, but you also need to hit your carb goal, especially for running or any endurance athlete, right? But even for the everyday person, your body needs glucose. And so if you don't get enough glucose through your diet, it can make glucose through protein. It's not the most efficient way.
Yeah.
But I work with a lot of people that are trying to stay, fairly muscular and run. And so I try to explain to them like protein's important, but carbs are important both for your energy, but also to make sure that the max amount of protein that can go to your muscles can go to your muscles.
Yes. So, yeah, obviously protein, especially for athletes, is super important, but carbs as well. But I would say the complex carbohydrates is what people should stick to, whether they're athletes or not. Simple carbohydrates, and this kind of goes back to how it impacts the brain as well. But simple carbohydrates basically result in spikes of blood sugar and insulin and then crashes. And then you basically become addicted, or not necessarily addicted, but like reliant on those things to get you through the day because it's just like constant, ups and downs of mood and everything. And this is again how it impacts the brain. So like serotonin levels. But I think a lot of people forget that protein is, I guess, I guess as equally as important, especially for endurance athletes, but like the way proteins work in the brain. One thing that I think some people might, I don't know, you might know this, you might not, but like if you have sources that are high in tryptophan, this is basically a natural step to serotonin without the boost of blood sugar and things like that. But then tryptophan can, when you're exercising and you eat other proteins, tryptophan's able to get into the brain easier because it doesn't have to compete with the larger proteins that go towards muscle replenishment. But it also like helps the brain as well, boost the brain, the mood, ability to function, things like that. And this is like, you know, I feel like what endurance athletes especially need at the end of the race, where they're like, "Yes, I can do it." Things
I
like
didn't know that.
that.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, this is like, I don't know. I feel like, as I said, the brain is so overlooked, and the way food interacts with the brain isn't really ever talked about. It's usually like, how does food impact muscle? How does food influence, cholesterol and things like that? But it's like, most of our calories go to the brain. Let's talk about that instead. But that's like a service level brain talk. I won't nerd out on you too much today.
No, that's super interesting. I like it because it kind of in my brain. I don't know if you are familiar, but like the central governor theory of endurance athletics, like your brain governs your output so that you can stay alive. Um,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, it's super
Not
interesting to me,
just
especially.
endurance athlete. That's how it is for everyone.
Yeah, true. So I do have a lot of people ask me about like low carb diets, and I actually interestingly had an athlete last week ask me about, cutting out carbs when she runs marathons, and the studies that I looked that she was like referencing, which no fault of her, but I looked them up and they were mainly for like sedentary women, and so yeah, so it's like I feel like there's a big demonization of carbs, like carnivore diet, ketones, all that jazz.
Yes. I
What do you?
actually talk about that for a second?
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, the demonization of carbohydrates is very similar to the demonization of what used to be fat in media and everything, right? So, one of the reasons that fats became the villain and even animal fats, which I think I think gets a pretty bad rap for things that really aren't caused by animal fats. And there's so many studies that actually have basically shown actually animal fats are really good for all aspects of your body, obviously in moderation, everything in moderation. But this was a way for a lot of the sugar companies to say, "Oh, okay, fats are bad. Come look at what we have over here." So it's actually how these food corporations and food companies are competing with each other. Basically, what wins at the end of the day is messaging and marketing. So I think carbohydrates fats. Proteins probably won't ever really get I mean, I guess if you look at the agricultural sector, people are trying to demonize certain proteins as well, but it's usually because there's another company behind that that just wants a bigger audience because that's their paycheck, right? So I typically just kind of ignore some of those things. Now, there are certain carbohydrates and certain fats that aren't good. And this is when it comes back to scientifically, how do these fats work in the body? Some of them do cause a lot of problems depending on what types of fats. And yeah, going back to that simple sugar, even even like breakfast cereals, right? They're super high in sugar, muffins, pastries, things like that. Everyone likes those, right? But if you have them every day, it actually can impact the brain in pretty severe ways, and I'm talking like atrophy of the brain if we're consuming all of these simple carbohydrates for a super long period of time and like a lot of them, right? But it also like simple carbohydrates, as I mentioned, cause the blood sugar to spike, cause insulin to spike. And then when that happens, because there are simple carbohydrates involved, it still has that effect of serotonin. It's just like a blast of serotonin to the brain, and it kind of creates that, "Oh, don't worry, everything will be fine," kind of feeling, because serotonin is a calming effect, it helps regulate the mood, but if it's basically blasted into the brain, it wears off, that's when we have the sugar spikes, and then we become a little bit irritable when that crashes, moody, things like that, and then we just go, "Oh, well, the chocolate bar made me feel better last time. I'll have another." But when that happens, like, when we have those simple carbohydrates and we go through those blood sugar waves, it also impacts our ability to focus. So, we aren't going to be able to reach those deadlines when kids come home from school and we give them, like, a sugary snack, cookies, and, like, a soda or something like that. While they're going to have a bit of an energy spike, they also won't be able to focus on their homework, things like that, and this is because of how those simple carbohydrates from essentially processed foods, like, again, going back to, like, baked goods or chocolates and things like that, how that influences the brain. But if you have, complex carbohydrates, it still releases that serotonin for the brain, but it's just over a more gradual period. So you don't have the spikes in blood sugar, and it's basically going to set you up so that you can still do, the work and focus and essentially have the energy for the rest of the day instead of crashing 30 minutes later.
That's so funny you mentioned breakfast cereals. My wife's mom used to homemake everything, and they never had very sugary cereals, and she's a first grade teacher now, and we got some Apple Jacks because she never had Apple Jacks, and I was like, "Oh, you gotta try these, they're so good." And she ate so much, she was like, "No wonder my kids are, like, so hyper in the morning, like, this is what they eat for breakfast."
Yep.
It was so
Yeah,
funny to
and
see
then,
her
like
brain just
yeah, but they have that sugar high, essentially, and then towards lunchtime, they'll probably crash in their lunch boxes or from the school, they might have, cookies or whatever, which again is fine if, it's not a constant flow of that sort of thing, but it's it's also, like, especially for kids, right? If you're giving them not necessarily you, but if people are giving them, really sugary foods just to get them through whatever activity or school, things like that, and then say, "Okay, sit down and do all this homework." You're kind of setting them up to fail in that regards, but, you know, that's that's a big focus, I think, for parents is how this works with kids, and then they kind of forget, "Oh, this also relates to me." Like, I can't do these things either. I still have to fuel my body correctly and essentially set it up for success. Like, it's whether it's for children or adults, I think it's the same nutritional roadmap, essentially, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So when I work with somebody for nutrition, since I'm mainly working with athletes, I mainly focus on macronutrients and don't even say anything about calories. And I
Yeah,
tend to give them like a protein goal and then range for typically ranges, because everybody's different. And then
yeah.
we kind of narrow it in as we work together. That's what I normally do for people. That's not the only way. There's plenty of other ways. I'm curious how you work with people. Like, what's your approach?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to figuring out what's happening now and like what's the habit that has kind of been formed. If it is like, something low carb, high protein, high fat, things like that, the question you then have to ask is, okay, why? And then it's also really important for me to kind of understand that person's personality because depending on their personality, can also dictate what diet might be better. And sometimes it is like an experimental approach, like, let's try this and see how we feel. But like if you have someone that has a high protein diet and low carbohydrate, that's fine if it's like if you have problems with low serotonin, which again comes back to that moodiness. But then if you have someone who's kind of an impulsive eater, and really struggles with some of that, that's a different area of the brain that needs to actually kind of be looked at. So, depending on the personality and the habits of individuals could actually determine the different types of diets that might work best. So, someone that has like a lot of sugar in their diet might actually be influenced in a worse way than mainly because of like the impulsiveness of their behavior or whatever. Because then it's like, oh, there's sugar, I'm just gonna keep eating it. But it kind of goes back to first, how they look at food, what's the habit, what's the behavior, and then what's the end goal? And then we kind of can piece together what's firing in the brain, what needs a little bit more attention, because at the end of the day, I think anything we eat, it is going to impact the brain. And we have to really take care of that because if we don't and we neglect it, it can start to atrophy. It can in some cases lead to dementia, people think. Like, some people think that different diets and different foods that we incorporate over a long period of time can actually lead to dementia. But yeah, it's more of figuring out the individual person, what they're struggling with, and yeah, trying to figure out, okay, based on your brain behavior, is a low fat diet, a low protein, not low protein, low fat, low carb diet going to work better for you? And it's usually comes back to their habits that they've already formed.
So something that I haven't dealt with yet, but I imagine it will come up at some point is somebody coming and like, hey, I have this goal, and it's pretty clear that they probably have some sort of eating disorder. I've had a few people come to me and been very upfront, like I've had an eating disorder in the past, and these systems didn't work, and so we worked through like if we would be a good fit. Some of them yes, some of them not, and the ones I've worked with have had good results, but I do like worry, like how do I handle when somebody comes to me like gracefully? Because I can't just be like, you have an eating disorder, I won't work with you. Like that's not going to help them at all. I'm just
Yeah,
interested to hear your thoughts on it because I'm sure through all of your education as well, there's a lot of talk on eating disorders. At least I would hope there is.
yeah. Yeah, so I guess to clarify, so you're asking, like, if someone comes to me with an eating disorder, how do I say yes or no, I'll work with them? Is that what you're asking?
I'd be interested to like, yeah, hear your approach and the lines get really blurred on like scope of practice. So where would you feel comfortable intervening and, having a conversation with them? And where would you feel more comfortable? Like that's not, I'm not an eating disorder specialist. Like, here's some other resources.
Yeah. Well, okay, I think I am always upfront with people, and I will say, like, I'm not an eating disorder specialist, and I'm not a nutritionist. I have a really strong background in food science and the way food influences like behavior and brain health and things like that. But that way, it's kind of a caveat and say, okay, if you think that's what you need, I can send you in the right direction because I also think if you say that and you're upfront about it, it shows to them that you want to help them, but you also want to have the best person help them, and it might not be you. And I think it's really admirable when people are upfront and say, "Look, I want to help you. I just might not be the right person." But if it's and in some cases, sadly, it is pretty obvious that people have an eating disorder. And like when I was 105 pounds, you could basically see my ribs through my shirt. So it's like I didn't think I had an eating disorder, but I obviously did. But I think if someone is willing to work with you knowing that, I think you take the right approach and not focus on calories. Don't even mention calories. It's more like quantity of food. Okay, obviously that's similar with calories, but like when I first started recovering to the point I am now, I looked at the plate that I had before and said, okay, I need to add at least, you know, another 1 or 2 things to the plate, and then we'll see how I feel. Don't just overload people, especially if it's, like, under eating issues. Don't just overload people and say, "Go eat, like, a whole buffet of food," obviously. Like, it's a really slow, gradual approach, and it's more I think that has to happen because that individual has to be okay with knowing that they're fueling their body in a better way that they were before. That way they can actually continue to live their life, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that actually goes right into something else I wanted to ask you about, which is you mentioned you felt like you couldn't eat anything. And then we've talked about now you don't worry about that anymore. But there's that
Yeah.
gap of like, how did you get to that point? And I can just imagine if I was in your situation before, how overwhelmed I would feel and hopeless, honestly. And so I would love to hear more about like your journey figuring out what you can eat to this point where you said you can cook your food and don't even think about it anymore.
Yeah, well, I will say I love cooking. I actually helped with the what was called the barbecue science class. I helped teach that at Ohio State. So I also helped other people learn how to cook, and it was really cool to see people who didn't have a cooking background basically go from not knowing what a grill was in some cases to being able to cook these incredible meals with basically with ease and not a lot of time. And I think for me, the biggest hurdle was more learning what I could eat. And in some of my classes, it became pretty obvious like, oh, it's basically natural foods like animal proteins I can have and fruits and vegetables I can have. Now, when I say that, I think a lot of people, and I had this mindset as well. I was like, that sounds boring. Where's like the fun stuff, basically? So I think one of the biggest challenges people have to overcome is thinking that healthy food and nutritional food is bland and boring because it's definitely not if you know what to do, and that kind of comes back to, like, with the barbecue science class and really every other cooking class that I've helped teach and things like that, but also for my own sake, I, as a scientist, love experimenting, and that comes to the kitchen as well, and when I figured out, like, "Oh, basically this is just, a science experiment in a very weird way. Let's see what happens." And I would just start experimenting with different flavors, different cooking methods. And because I'm, getting the PhD now, my time is pretty limited. So when I came over here, I was like, how do I make these really high quality, delicious, but also nutritional meals in not a lot of time and actually make them taste good? Because everyone I feel like there's a stigma around gluten-free food as well, where they're like, "Ugh," "That's probably gross." But I made just over the weekend, I made pulled pork nachos, and they were amazing, and I cooked them for a couple of people, and they were like, "This is like restaurant quality food," which is, that's a nice compliment for me, but that's kind of the level of cooking that I'm at now because of everything that I know, and part of my PhD is actually understanding how the texture and different properties of food change during the cooking process. So it's really fun for me to be able to take all of my research and then just bring it home and make really high quality meals. And then also, like for me, knowing that the food that I'm making with my own hands is nourishing myself and my family. It's such a gift. And I think one of the biggest things if someone's struggling with, under eating or overeating even, understanding that the food that you eat is a gift and it really is basically building your body from the inside out. So you want to ask yourself, is the food I'm eating helping me or is it hurting me? Is it causing problems or is it bringing me towards, a healthy life? And just having that sense of gratitude for everything you eat is really, I think, really important and really powerful as well.
I love that. I try to tell people too gratitude for your body because it carries you through life. And especially if you're under eating. That's not a easy task. Even if
Yes.
you're eating, even if you're eating enough, it's still a hard task. So
Yeah.
funny that you talk about your PhD because I nerd out over like I got a sous vide, so I've been like reading
Oh,
all
no.
about I've been reading all about meat and like time temperature tables and I don't know, reading super long blog posts on it. It's super fun. But
Just ask me, I'll tell you.
well, I didn't even realize the like USDA the time temperature tables for chicken because I was looking at these sous vide recipes for chicken breasts and people were cooking their chicken breasts like 150 degrees and I was like, this is not right. But then it's like
150 degrees.
yeah, like the USDA's time temperature table for what is it, pasteurization. So like if you hold it at 153 or something for like 3 hours, it still
Yeah,
kills
if you
this.
have the
Yeah,
time component, yeah.
right.
But
And the sous
typically,
vide,
like,
yeah.
for a food safety point, typically chicken is cooked to 165 degrees internal temperature, but look, you do what you want.
No, no. God, now you're gonna think that I like yeah, I'm gonna get food
Miss.
poisoning, but no, it has to do with like the sous vide. So slow cooking it. I don't know. I cook it warmer than that, but the recipes were actually it was yeah, I was taken aback. But
Yes.
from I think correct me if I'm wrong, but on your Instagram too, you have a lot of free recipe guides, right? If I remember.
Yeah, I think it should be there, but it's basically because I was asked so many times, because sometimes I post pictures of the food that I eat, and people are like, "There's no way that that's gluten-free," and I'm like, "Well, obviously it is because I ate it." But people have asked me so many times, they're like, okay, if you're eating it, it's healthy, it's nutritional, but it also probably tastes good. Can I have a few recipes just to try?" So I think the recipe guide that I have on my Instagram is 7 7 dinner recipes, and it's basically trying to show people that healthy cooking can really be easy because all of these recipes can be made in 40 minutes or less, and they just taste so good. Like, I have them on my weekly menu. I basically rotate through a bunch, but all of the recipes on that guide on Instagram are at least one of them shows up every week just because it is so good and it's so easy to make at the end of the day.
I'm gonna go download it. We'll
Yeah.
put it in the I'll put it in the show notes too, but being mindful of your time as you are, a PhD student, have a ton to do. Is there any other big topics you wanted to discuss?
I feel like we covered quite a bit today, but yeah, if you have any questions in the future, don't hesitate to reach out, please, because this is also a really nice opportunity for me to kind of break away from my PhD schedule. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today and all of your audience.
Yeah, it's fun. I'm a nerd, so I'm interested, and you're from Ohio, and you understand rural America like 4-H FFA,
Yes.
so it's good. So if
Yeah.
anybody wants to find out more, I mentioned your Instagram. We'll link it down in the show notes, but where can people find you?
So I'm on Instagram mainly, and then I also have a website. It's called lemasterfit.com. It's just my last name, fit.com. And then I'm just gonna check because I don't actually remember my Instagram handle, but it's Michelle_Lemasterfit for Instagram. I have a Facebook page, but I think I'm more active on Instagram and the blog posts and emails. So if that's where anyone wants to find me, come over and talk to me. I'm happy to have a chat.
Good deal. Well, it was good to talk to you. I will let you get on with your week, and I will get ready for bed to start my week
Yeah.
tomorrow.
All right. Thank
Have a
you
good
so
one.
much again for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. I hope you
Yeah.
have a good week and good luck with everything.
Yeah, you too.